No human being should suffer or being treated inhumane. And when it comes to children, it shouldn't be allowed. This is shocking news. It is called Violence, Discrimination and Neglect Towards Tibetan Children. A report submitted to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child on violations of the Convention on the Rights of the Child by the People's Republic of China against the children of Tibet, submitted by Tibet Justice Center, California, February 2005. And table of contents. Executive summary. 1. Introduction. A. Tibet's historical sovereignty and the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. B. The Third Forum on Work in Tibet. 2. The committee's previous concerns and recommendations. 3. Maltreatment by state actors, arbitrary detention in inhumane conditions, forced labor, torture, and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment and punishment. A. The legal context. Pertinent provisions on the CIC. B. China's three-level detention system. C. Arbitrary detention in inhumane conditions and forced labor. D. Torture in detention. E. Torture and other cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment and punishment in schools. F. Pervasive anti-Tibetan discrimination. 4. Education, impediments to access and discriminatory content. A. The legal context, pertinent provisions of the CRC. B. School fees. C. Bribes, political connections and political opinions. D. Lack of public education facilities in rural Tibet and the closure of private and monastic schools. E. Pervasive anti-Tibetan discrimination, the language of instruction, the political and ideological curriculum, and the repression of Tibetan culture, history, and religious expression. 5. Health care, impediments to access, disease, and malnutrition. A. The legal context, pertinent provisions of the CRC. B. Access to health care. C. Disease and malnutrition among Tibetan children. 6. Conclusions and recommendations. Executive summary. This report evaluates China's compliance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC 1. And CRC 1, we have the notes here. Let's see. Adopted and opened for signature, ratification and accession by General Assembly Resolution 44 25 20 20th November 1989, entry into force 2nd September 1990. With respect to Tibet, in connection with committee's review of China's second periodic report, although China submitted its second periodic report on 27th of June 2003 as of February 8, 2005, and an English translation was not yet available. This report focuses on the time period covered by China's second periodic report, 1994 to 1999, with reference to some more current information. It assesses the degree to which the Chinese government respects and promotes Tibetan children's human rights in 3 areas: arbitrary detention in inhumane conditions, torture and other maltreatment by state actors, education and health care and nutrition. It concludes that in all 3 areas, China has fallen far short of its obligations under international law and has failed to respond to the concerns and recommendations made by this committee in its concluding observations regarding China's initial report CRC C15 at 56, 7th June 1996. Our report begins with an overview of the history and political status of Tibet, because the human rights violations against Tibetan children cannot be understood outside the context of Tibet's history or of the human rights abuses against the Tibetan people generally. Tibet was a sovereign state prior to the Chinese invasion in 1949. As a consequence, humanitarian law continues to apply during the entire period of the illegal occupation of Tibet. In addition, the Tibetan people have the right to self-determination, and the failure to recognize that right remains the root cause of the human rights violations against Tibetans generally and Tibetan children specifically. We also discuss in particular the policies adopted by the government of China towards the Tibetan people during the 1994 Third Forum on Work in Tibet. The impact of these policies was not fully felt at the times this committee reviewed China's initial report. The Third Forum, however, including policies designed to further suppress Tibetan Buddhist culture, alliance to the Dalai Lama, and nationalist sentiment, have deeply touched Tibetan children's lives. The report first addresses the subject of arbitrary detention of children and abuse and torture during detention. China systematically detains Tibetan children arbitrarily. The detentions are unlawful because a. They are generally done by executive rather than judicial action. B. They result from children's participation in activities which are protected by the CRC and other international legal instruments. And C. The children are afforded no procedural rights or other legal protections. China subjects Tibetan children to torture in detention. Detained children are beaten with a host of different implements, burned with hot irons, subjected to electric shocks, and tortured in various other ways. Girls have been subjected to sexual abuse. In addition, Tibetan children are detained in inhumane conditions. Detained children often do not receive sufficient food, are denied medical care, and are often not provided adequate heat, clothing, water, light, and sanitation facilities. China subjects Tibetan children to torture and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment and punishment in state-run schools. Tibetan children have been beaten, subjected to electric shocks, forced to kneel on sharp objects, locked in dark rooms for long periods of time, and burned. The report next discusses the availability and adequacy of education for Tibetan children. China unlawfully charges fees for primary education, fees which sometimes exceed the average per capita income in rural Tibet. Bribes and political connections often determine whether Tibetan children are admitted to primary and secondary schools, as well as whether those Tibetan children who are admitted are actually taught. Tibetan children whose parents' political opinions are disfavored by the Chinese government are discriminated against. China devotes most of its educational funding in Tibet to the urban areas with the highest concentrations of Chinese settlers, leaving the rural areas where 80% of Tibetans live to fend for themselves. State-run educational facilities are, as a result, scarce in Tibet, but China has also been closing some monastic, affiliated and private schools that are the only alternative for rural Tibetan children to distant and poorly funded government facilities. China discriminates against Tibetan children by making Chinese the primary medium of instruction, by imposing a political and ideological curriculum in schools, by refusing to teach Tibetan children about their own history, and by prohibiting manifestations of Tibetan cultural and religious identity. The report finally addressed the provision of health care for Tibetan children. China fails to provide adequate medical care to Tibetan children. In rural areas, medical facilities are so scarce that many Tibetans cannot obtain any medical care at all. In rural and urban areas alike, Tibetans are charged exorbitant security deposits for medical care. As a result, infant mortality is 3 times as high in Tibet as in China as a whole. Easily treatable diarrheal diseases are rampant. Tuberculosis, for which there is an effective vaccine, is widespread, and more than half of Tibetan children suffer severe growth stunting caused by chronic malnutrition. We conclude with recommendations for action to address these findings. One, introduction. Tibet Justice Center is honored to submit this report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child Committee. Tibet Justice Center, previously named International Committee of Lawyers for Tibet, is a non-governmental organization based in Berkeley, California. Tibet Justice Center advocates self-determination for the Tibetan people through legal action and education. We promote human rights, environmental protection, and a peaceful resolution to the situation in Tibet. Our report provides additional information to facilitate the committee's evaluation of China's compliance with the CRC with regard to Tibetan children. In the report, we emphasize the special circumstances that render Tibetans particularly susceptible and sensitive to rights violations. We urge the committee to review the evidence of violations of Tibetan rights in the context of China's illegal invasion of Tibet in 1949, its division of historical Tibetan territory, and China's failure to accord the Tibetans their right to self-determination. We will, throughout this report, also place violations of children's rights in the context of violations of Tibetans' human rights generally. A. Tibet's historical sovereignty and the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. The Chinese occupation of Tibet is illegal under international law because Tibet was an independent nation when Chinese troops invaded. Extensive study by legal scholars, including the International Commissions of Jurists, supports the conclusion that Tibet was a sovereign nation when it was invaded by China in 1949, and that the entry of China's armed forces into Tibet was an act of aggression under international law. 3. Note. Although China submitted international law, yes. International Commission of Jurists, Tibet and the Chinese People's Republic, International Commission of Jurists, yes. Tibet, the position in international law, report of the Conference of International, Tibet's sovereignty and the Tibetan people's rights to self-determination. I didn't get that. We go back. I think the note didn't work. When we refer to Tibet, we mean the Tibetan provinces of Kham, Amdo and Uzang. The Chinese authorities have divided Tibet into the Tibetan Autonomous Region, TAR, TRR. About 40% of historical Tibet and a number of Tibetan prefectures that have been subsumed into the Chinese provinces of Sichuan, Qinghai, Yunnan and Gansu. China's division of traditional Tibet is in itself a major international law violation. We also point out that because China's invasion was illegal, all provisions of humanitarian law, including those relating specifically to racial discrimination, are enforced in Chinese-occupied Tibet. We have a note more, and now I hope it functions. 4. Under fundamental principles of humanitarian law is applicable as long as an occupying power still governs, even if actual armed conflict is not still taking place. Article 2, common to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Yes, we take a pause. Yeah, we complete the sentence. The application of humanitarian law in Tibet underscores our sense of gravity of the violations carried out by China in Tibet, including the division of the Tibetan territory. Yes, we are run out of battery, so we continue in next video. Thank you.